Are you there, Dr. John?
Yes, I am, Mick, but I don't know that I've managed to turn that echo off.
Yes, you have. That's good. That's awesome. Thank you, Dr. John. Now, as I was saying before, I was looking at Es Rock on Google Earth. I'm looking again right now. Now, of course, the rock turned sideways. That means that there's many, many, many layers that I'm looking at there. Oh, there's hundreds and hundreds of layers. You can see all the lines going through the rock, which, to a geologist would mean millions of years. And looking at one side of the rock to the other side, so you're looking at lots of layers, it looks like the exact same colour and composition from top to bottom, Dr. John. Now, when you see layers that are so similar, you can't imagine that colour being over millions and millions of years. You'd think that there'd be all different colours and compositions throughout the rock, as opposed to maybe a flood that only takes 40 days.
Yes, well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? And if you compare that with what you see in other sedimentary rock, like down the M1, if you're driving to Sydney, you see that those layers are actually different colours because they have been sorted. It wasn't quite as torrential down in that area when it formed, but it got carved out torrentially when the water ran off into the ocean. Mm-hmm. But it didn't form torrentially, whereas it looks as though Ayers Rock and the Olgas formed torrentially. Mm-hmm. But you're quite right. How would you get exactly the same composition going all the way through if there were millions of years between the layers? You wouldn't be able to do that. Mm. And sedimentary rock actually is really the greatest demonstration of the truth of the Bible. If we think of sedimentary rock like down the M1 or there in the Blue Mountains, or if you go overseas over to the Grand Canyon and places like that, what you find is that you see all of those layers, but when you have a look at them, you see that there's a very, very sharp interface between any of the layers. Mm-hmm. So it's really impossible for there to have been millions of years between one layer being deposited on top of the other. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you'd have soil and vegetation or whatever between the layers. And there are plenty of places in the world where you see all of those layers bent up into a U shape where the rock has been uplifted. Now, of course, you can't bend rock without breaking it. And the only way you could get that sort of formation is if the layers were still soft sand when they got lifted up and bent like that, and then they solidified in that U shape. Mm. So it's very obvious when you look at sedimentary rock that it has to have been formed not in the way that the secular world believes. Mm-hmm. And the other very interesting thing about it is that evolution theory depends on those layers having millions of years gaps between them. Mm-hmm. Because what those sedimentary rock layers have in them is buried living things that were formerly living, like vegetation or animals or whatever, what we call fossils. Mm-hmm. Now, when the paleontologist looks at that, he sees certain fossils in a layer, and he says, oh, right, okay, well, that layer must be so many millions of years old because it's got those fossils in it. Yep. And then when he goes and finds a similar layer, he says, well, that's got to be the same age because it's got the same sort of fossils. So there's a circular argument where the layers are dated by the fossils and the fossils are dated by the layers that they're in. So it really doesn't make sense. And when you think about it, the Bible does tell us about an event that killed all of these animals on the face of the earth, and that was Noah's flood. Yep. So everything that we see, and let's face it, 75% of the Earth's surface is sedimentary rock. And it's pretty obvious that it was formed in the most amazing flood that has ever occurred on Earth. Mm. And the Bible talks about it, and it was Noah's flood. Now, the secular world doesn't really want to believe that. Even though the evidence screams that there was this massive flood, and when you look at evidence from anthropology and genetics and so on, you can see that all of it is consistent with that flood. But the secular world doesn't want to accept it because it might mean that the Bible is true after all. And that would never do. We don't want to have the Bible as being true.
Absolutely. I can understand why they come up with that. And of course, you imagine some of the little animals and some of the big animals. I mean, some animals would have died sooner than other animals in the flood because, some are, they can live in water a whole lot better than others, in which case they will be on different layers, I guess, depending on their size. But those layers might only be days difference, not millions of years difference. Dr. John, we'll be back very shortly. We're going to jump into a bit of Switchfoot right now. You're on 94.9. It is 25 past 8. Yeah, that was John Newsom, Going Home. You're on that, well, Home, that's the name of the song. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 25 minutes to 9. And we have Dr. John from Creation Ministries International on the line at the moment. He's been talking to us about some of that sedimentary rock out in the middle of Australia and a big flood. What do you know? And, of course, Dr. John can answer your questions on our text line. Questions about creation, evolution, little green man, dinosaurs, all that sort of stuff. And we did have a question come through, Dr. John. The question is, after the 12 tribes of Israel had been scattered across the world, is there any way to distinctly identify each of them today? That was from Kevin.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question from Kevin, and quite an involved one, so I think we'll have to take that on notice for next week, Mick. But, Kevin, we will certainly address your question next week. And look, thank you for the question, and if I can say to all the other listeners out there, we'd love to hear your questions if you can text them through, because we really want to answer the things that you want to hear when we're here on air. And look, Mick, I was really encouraged by the announcements about those Christian schools that came in just before your weather report. And I noticed that St. Philip's Christian School said they're praying Psalm 91 for everybody. And so are you at Rima, I know that, and so are many Christian people throughout the world, because Psalm 91 is God's word to us and his promise of protection from all of these things like pestilences that we're getting at the moment. So thank you, St. Philip's. It was great to hear that coming through. But look, I wanted to just talk a little bit too, Mick, about so many scientists are not really open to Christian things, and they do tend to be evolution believers. And a lot of people wonder why it is that scientists are very, very hard to reach with the gospel. And they assume that it's because they see evolution in their everyday work. Well, of course, that's absolutely not true. When they've done their science-type courses, they've been taught the evolutionary history of the world, but when they actually get out in the field, they're only really working with the principles of chemistry and physics and mathematics, and evolution has absolutely nothing to do with that. So really, they are basing their lack of belief on what they were taught back at university, but not what they see in their everyday activities, in their operational science, the sort of work that they do every day in their laboratory. That's got nothing to do with the evolutionary supposed history of the world. So really, don't take too much notice of the fact that scientists, by and large, are not believers. It's really because of what they've been indoctrinated with in their science courses.
Absolutely. And I know in universities there's a real issue there. Quite often you find that uni students, when they submit a paper and there's too much Christian talk in there, they get marked down. So they're pretty much, told not to put too much Christianity into even answers to questions, regardless of beliefs.
Yes, well, that's right. And many of them start at university as full-on Christians, but because it's so spoken against and discouraged, and they're given all of this evolutionary stuff in science courses, some of them lose their faith tragically, and really it's important for them to be very much grounded in the principles that we talk about on this radio program. And I wanted to talk about another article. I don't know whether you saw it, Mick, on a Viking highway in Norway. Did you see that one?
Yeah, well, no, I didn't. But if you don't mind, Dr. John, we might come back to that one after this break. You are with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. It is 21 minutes to 9. We'll be back shortly. And that was Toby Mack with Undeniable. It is 17 minutes to 9. You're on 94.9. And Dr. John is on the line from Creation Ministries International. Of course, they've got a website, creation.com, where you can go to get all sorts of questions answered in regards to evolution and creation. But if you have a question, we'd prefer you send it through to us. If you have a question, chances are there's a lot of other people with a very similar question. So, just text it through to our text line, 0401 949 949. And of course, we answer your questions and talk about stuff that's come out in the news in the last week. And yes, Dr. John, you have reminded me of that particular story. I did see that story. I can remember looking at it. I was more interested in the ice and the snow and how that sort of works, because they were talking about how the stuff that they found on the particular trip that they used to go on has been preserved underneath a patch of ice that is very unlike a glacier, and stuff has been preserved really, really well from nearly 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, look, it was an amazing story, and of course this one comes from Norway, and I'm not surprised that you were interested because you're a bit of a snow bunny yourself. But this was a story about an ice sheet in between a couple of mountains there in Norway. And, of course, it talked about the difference between an ice sheet and a glacier, because a glacier is a river of ice, and because it's a river of ice, it actually moves. And when a glacier meets the sea, then chunks of it break off and fall into the ocean. And I'm sure many of our listeners have been on those Alaska cruises, and you see the Hubbard Glacier, and the ship goes right up close to it, and you see these chunks of ice falling off into the ocean. Mm-hmm. But, of course, an ice sheet is different. It's a bit more like a frozen lake. Mm. And this story about the Norway ice sheet was really a story about climate change. And I thought it was amazing that the researchers really only see what they're looking for. They don't really look at the big picture, because they have aerial photos of this ice sheet going back decades and so on, and it's most certainly shrinking. Yep. And, of course, they've said that's a case of climate change, which it probably is. But the interesting thing is what's been left behind when the ice sheet has shrunk around the edges, because what it did, it exposed a huge number of human artifacts. I mean, they found solidified horse manure and items of clothing and tools and broken down sleds and so on. And it's pretty obvious that that was a highway at one time, a pass between the two mountains. Mm-hmm. And they managed to carbon date a lot of those articles. Now, we've talked about carbon dating on this program before, and we've said how carbon dating is a bit inaccurate when you, certainly when you get answers like 30 and 40,000 years, then really you can't take too much notice of dates like that. Yep. But when you're only going back a couple of centuries or so, or maybe up to 1,000 years, carbon dating isn't too bad. Mm. And there's no doubt that they've been able to date these things at several centuries old, maybe even 1,000 years old or a little bit longer. But they don't seem to have connected the dots. All they've been looking at is the example that it is of climate change. But what it really means is that 1,000 years ago, there wasn't an ice sheet there. That was actually a highway, a Viking highway, a pass between those mountains, and it was traversed by people on sleds and horses and so on, moving backwards and forwards from summer to winter through those two mountains.
Yep.
So if you go back 1,000 years, they certainly didn't have any motor cars then, and they didn't have aeroplanes flying in the sky, and they didn't have any coal-fired power stations producing so-called pollution. So what was it that caused the climate change back then that made it no ice sheet there? I mean, they don't seem to have even examined that possibility. And when you think about it, even a place up there like Greenland, which doesn't look green anymore, it looks white.
Yes.
But it got the name Greenland because 1,000 years ago it was farmland. So things were obviously very different up around Norway and the Arctic regions when you go back several centuries, very different from what they are now. So what we're seeing in that sort of climate change is it's only reverting to what it once was. But they don't seem to have made any mention of that.
Yes.
And I thought that was very, very interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
The problem is that if you have a world view that goes back millions of years, you don't think about these things. And I'd like to talk about that when we come back.
Absolutely. We're with Dr. John here from Creation Ministries International, talking about how there's been an ice sheet, and this is called the Lendbreen Ice Patch. And that ice sheet was, it wasn't there about 1,000 years ago. In fact, they've dated stuff there back to, I think they said about 300 AD up till somewhere around 1,000 years ago. And obviously it was a bit of a super highway back in the day. People used to use it all the time. Stuff found on the ground under the ice. But then the ice has been there for centuries and centuries now in Norway, which just proves that, this whole environmental change thing mightn't all be about, I mean, I don't like pollution, don't get me wrong, we've got a lot of polluting things around, but there was a lot of other things that used to change the environment. You are on 94.9 this morning. We'll be back shortly. And we've got Dr. John on the blower at the moment. He's talking to us from home. Yes, whilst all this weird stuff's going on in the world, we're in different locations. But of course, Dr. John from Creation Ministries International has been talking to us about climate change a little bit in the last segment. And this particular article he's talking about said, and with Norway's cryosphere already slipping away in the face of climate change and a series of punishingly hot summers, every seemingly miraculous find is bittersweet. I don't really understand that, Dr. John, because they're talking about, all this climate change that was as it is today, only 1,000 years ago, where you can actually walk over there.
Yes, well, look, Mick, it's a good example, I think, of how you see the past really does have a bearing on how you see the present and the future. And when we get to climate change, we mentioned how those researchers really only saw climate change in what they had discovered, whereas if they'd really thought about it, they would have recognised that centuries ago, or 1,000 years or so ago, the climate obviously was very different there. But I mean, we know that there's a lot of politics and political agendas in the climate change debate, but there are a lot of very, very genuine concerned people out there about climate change. But they are very probably believers in millions and billions of years and evolution. And if you think that things have been going on in a similar way for millions of years, and suddenly you see things changing over what appear to you to be a very, very short space of time, then it really is alarming. And you can understand how a lot of the people do look around for what is causing this. And, of course, they can see increases in the human population of the Earth and a lot of increase in human activity. And they would then suspect that really might be what is causing the climate change, because they think things have been going along in a similar vein for millions of years, and all of a sudden we see this change. But if your time frame for the Earth is much shorter, and you do see that the Bible gives the correct account of Earth history, then you know that the original Earth was very different from the Earth that we have now. A good example would be that we know that there's coal in the Antarctic, for example, and there are no trees in the Antarctic anymore. So clearly, when you go back in time, things were very different from what they are now. And of course, we've talked about earlier on in the program today, the evidence for Noah's flood and all the sedimentary rocks and so on. Well, the secular world doesn't want to believe that these things actually happened. They don't want to believe that the biblical history is actually the true history of the earth, and things have not been going on in a very, very similar vein for millions of years. They've only been going on for a very, very short space of time. And if you are a Bible believer, you expect to see fluctuations in climate, and you don't find them quite as alarming as a lot of the people who are very, very vocal supporters of climate change and man-made climate change do.
Yes, absolutely. And, of course, people should be a little bit concerned about pollution change. Yes, we see pollution because we've made a little bit of a mess in recent years, but climate change, yeah, they almost push that pollution change agenda onto climate change and then turn it into political agendas as well.
Yes, well, it's very obvious, as you rightly said, that the human race has been polluting and damaging the planet in an enormous way, and we really do have to stop doing that.
Well, Dr. John, again, thank you so much for this morning. Another great morning, and we look forward to next week, next Tuesday. You'll still be around?
I'll be back.
Awesome. Well,
just like Arnold.
That's awesome. It is 1 minute to 9. You're on 94.9 this morning. We've got the news and weather coming up shortly. Good morning. Oh, hang on. Let's just try that again. Good morning.